The last time a Campbell and a Mackenzie had been in the same room, someone had left with a broken nose. That was 1987. Ellison had heard the story so many times she could recite it. She told herself this was different. This was business. A government tender, a shared coastline, one meeting. Caleb Mackenzie shook her hand across the table and didn't smile. She told herself that was fine too. It was only later, much later, in a stone tower with no signal and a storm that wasn't stopping, that she admitted she'd been telling herself quite a lot of things. The rain arrived before Ellison Campbell did, which seemed fitting. It swept in from the North Sea sometime around 4 in the morning, drumming its fingers against every window of the Dunmore Arms, as if reminding the old hotel that the world outside still existed, still had opinions, still intended to be heard. By the time the first gray light pushed itself reluctantly over the eastern hills, the gravel drive was a shallow river, and the rose bushes her mother had planted along the garden wall were bent sideways, shaking their heads at the whole business. Ellison drove through it all in a rented Volvo that smelled of someone else's air freshener, with 2 suitcases in the boot and a carrier bag of groceries on the passenger seat, because she hadn't been able to trust that her father was eating. She'd bought oatmeal and tinned soup and the good cheddar he liked, the sharp one from the Orkney dairy that cost 3 times what the supermarket block did and was worth every penny. Small things. The kind of things you buy when you don't know what else to do, and buying things feels like an action, feels like movement, feels like you haven't simply abandoned the life you built in Edinburgh and come back to the coast with your tail between your legs and your heart doing something complicated in your chest that you haven't yet found the right word for. She hadn't been home in 14 months. The driveway gates were rusted open, she noticed. They'd always been rusted open, actually, but when she was a child they'd been rusted open at a proud angle, commanding the approach to the house with a kind of weathered authority. Now they leaned inward toward each other like 2 old men who'd had too much whiskey, their iron scrollwork thick with orange, and their hinges lost somewhere beneath years of salt air and neglect. She drove between them slowly, not because the gap was tight, but because she wasn't ready to arrive. Not quite yet. The house itself was still beautiful. She had braced herself for worse. The Dunmore Arms had been in the Campbell family for 4 generations. A Georgian manor converted to a hotel sometime in the 1940s by her great-grandfather, a man of tremendous ambition and absolutely catastrophic financial judgment, whose decisions had been providing the family with interesting problems ever since. It sat on the headland above the village of Dunmore Bay, 47 rooms of pale sandstone and sash windows and a roofline that could charitably be called eccentric, facing the water with the kind of stoic dignity that only buildings which have survived 2 centuries of Scottish weather can honestly claim. But the paint was peeling on the window frames. The wisteria that ran along the east wing had gone entirely rogue, swallowing a drainpipe and apparently making a serious attempt on the guttering. The east terrace, where guests had once taken afternoon tea overlooking the bay, had a section of railing missing that someone had replaced with what appeared to be orange plastic construction netting. This was, she thought, not a good sign. She parked and sat for a moment with the engine running and the rain hammering the roof, looking at the hotel and feeling something that was partly grief and partly love and partly the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding everything together for a long time and has just run out of hands. Then she picked up the carrier bag of groceries and went inside. Her father was in the kitchen, which surprised her, because it was barely 7 o'clock and he had never in her memory voluntarily risen before 9. He was sitting at the long pine table with a cup of tea and the newspaper, wearing his old fisherman's jumper and the reading glasses she didn't remember him needing. And when she pushed the door open, he looked up and his face did something that she hadn't expected, something unguarded and young, something that reminded her painfully of the way he'd looked when she was a girl and he was the largest, safest, most competent person in her world. "You came," he said. "Of course I came," she said, and set the groceries down on the counter and crossed the kitchen and hugged him, holding on a moment longer than was strictly necessary, feeling the surprising thinness of his shoulders under the wool. He smelled of tea and old books and, faintly, of the medicated shampoo she recognized from the hospital that had sent her the letter she wasn't supposed to know he'd hidden from her. "I bought oatmeal," she said, pulling back. "I have oatmeal," her father said. "You have oatmeal from 2022. I threw it away. That's perfectly good oatmeal." "Dad," He had the grace to look slightly abashed. Robert Campbell was 68 years old, which was not especially old, but he had been conducting an extended argument with his health for the past 3 years, an argument he was slowly losing with the resigned stubbornness of a man who has decided that if he's going down on his own terms, and he doesn't particularly want anyone to make a fuss about it. She made fresh tea and sat across from him and looked through the kitchen window at the bay, and there it was on the opposite headland. The dark bulk of Dunmore Castle and its obscene new wing of glass and steel, gleaming even through the rain like a person who had been told they were old-fashioned and responded by buying the loudest possible pair of trainers. The Mackenzies had built a spa. Ellison looked at it for exactly 3 seconds before her father said, without looking up from his newspaper, "Don't." "I'm not doing anything," she said. "You have the face," he said. "You've had that face since you were 7. She turned back to her tea. "Is Caleb Mackenzie still running it?" "He is. You'll see him Thursday. The Coastal Heritage Fund dinner. You'll go in my place." He said it carefully, in the voice of a man making a request he is framing as a statement. She looked at the castle's glass wing through the rain and thought about Caleb Mackenzie, whom she hadn't seen in 6 years and who occupied a specific drawer in the back of her mind, the one labeled people who have always been better at this than you and known it. She had met him exactly 4 times in her life. Each meeting had been brief. Each one had left her with the feeling of having gone a few rounds with someone who wasn't even slightly winded. "Fine," she said. "I'll go." The Coastal Heritage Fund dinner was held in the Dunmore Village Hall, which was an optimistic name for a stone building that smelled of floor wax and olden books and seated approximately 90 people in conditions of enthusiastic discomfort. Nobody could feel particularly grand in the Dunmore Village Hall. Even the mayor had to fold his knees sideways to fit under the table. Ellison arrived slightly late, which was an accident she was allowing herself to pretend was deliberate. She'd spent 40 minutes standing in front of her suitcase staring at clothes that all felt wrong, which was not a thing she usually did. She was practical. She was competent. She had, in the past 3 years in Edinburgh, successfully overseen the restructuring of 2 hotel properties and been described in a trade publication as formidably decisive, which she had found pleasing. She was wearing a green dress she'd bought for a conference in Dublin and had not thought about since, and she had her dark red hair pinned up with a clip that was either elegant or slightly messy depending on the angle, and she had decided, crossing the car park in the rain with her good coat over her shoulders, that she was not dressing for anyone in this room. She was representing her family. She was absolutely not thinking about who else would be at this dinner. She found her seat and introduced herself to the people around her and was managing the conversation with practiced smoothness when she looked up, and he was there. He was standing at the bar, or at what was serving as a bar, talking to the mayor, wearing a dark suit that was better than everything else in the room by approximately 3 tax brackets. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe she'd simply forgotten, and he had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and an expression of polite attentiveness that she recognized from their previous encounters as the expression he wore when he was thinking something he'd chosen not to say. Caleb Mackenzie, 34 years old, St. Andrews graduate, Edinburgh Business School, reportedly excellent at everything. Reportedly the reason that Dunmore Castle had gone from a quietly failing heritage property to one of the most talked-about boutique hotels in the Highlands, which was the kind of achievement that Ellison would have found entirely admirable in anyone else. As if he'd felt the direction of her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met across the room with the particular directness of 2 people who have been aware of each other's presence since they walked in, but have been carefully not looking. He gave a small, precise nod, like someone acknowledging a weather system they'd been tracking. She returned it with the same calibrated economy, turned back to her wine, and thought, right, here we are. The dinner was partly pleasant and partly an ordeal in the way of these things. The food was fine, the speeches ran long, and Ellison drank perhaps slightly more wine than she'd intended, which she attributed to the drafts coming in under the hall doors and absolutely nothing else. She was mid-conversation with the newspaper woman on her right, who was turning out to be considerably more interesting than her initial impression, when someone stopped beside her chair. She knew before she looked up. There was something about the specific quality of the pause. Deliberate. Patient. "Miss Campbell," Caleb Mackenzie said. "I heard you were back." Up close he was, she thought, very unfairly constructed. There was nothing individually extraordinary about his features, but they added up to something that required a moment to adjust to, like coming into a room that's brighter than you expected. His eyes were a peculiar shade of gray-green, the color of the sea on an overcast afternoon. He had a small scar through his left eyebrow from a sailing accident at 14, which she'd been told once by her friend Morag, and had retained with the casualness of someone filing away information they are certain they will never need. He pulled out the empty chair beside her and sat down, which she hadn't invited him to do. "Your father's not here tonight," he said. "He's not well," she said, and heard the way her voice changed slightly on the words, something she couldn't control. She watched him notice it. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, simply and directly, and she found it harder to dismiss than she'd expected. "He'll be fine," she said, which was the sentence she'd been saying to everyone, and which was becoming, with each repetition, slightly less certainty and slightly more wish. "The coastal project," he said, and something shifted in his register, moving from personal to professional with practiced smoothness. "The government tender. The shoreline restoration. Has your father spoken to you about it?" She kept her expression even. "I've seen the documentation. Then you know the timeline. And the capital requirements." "I know my own business's finances, Mr. Mackenzie." "I'm sure you do," he said. "And I know mine. Which is why we should probably have a conversation this week, before the tender closes. Wednesday morning, if you're available. 10 o'clock. She looked at him. He looked back, that gray-green gaze quite steady, and she thought about the arithmetic she'd done on the train from Edinburgh and hadn't liked the results of, and she thought about the east wing and the orange plastic netting and the rose bushes her mother had planted, and she said, "Our library. We have a library." "I know you have a library," he said, with something that was almost amusement but kept itself in check. He stood up, smooth and unhurried. "Wednesday, 10 o'clock. He nodded. "Miss Campbell." "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, and watched him move away through the room and tried to decide whether the thing currently happening in the region of her sternum was professional anxiety or something else entirely, and found she wasn't able to arrive at a satisfying conclusion. The library was the best room in the hotel. It was on the ground floor of the West Wing, a long room with bookshelves to the ceiling and 2 windows that looked out toward the bay and a fireplace that worked properly, which was rarer than it should have been in the rest of the building. Her great-grandfather had collected books with the same chaotic energy he'd brought to all his decisions, which meant the shelves were full of things that had no business being together. 19th-century agricultural manuals next to first-edition poetry, next to a complete collection of Edwardian adventure novels. She had the fire going before Caleb arrived, which she'd done because the morning was cold and not, she told herself firmly, because she was managing the room's atmosphere. She had the relevant documents on the table. She had coffee made. She was, she thought, a professional. He arrived at precisely 10 o'clock and stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the room with the same assessment he seemed to bring to most things. He was wearing a dark sweater today instead of a suit, and it made him seem slightly less like a closing argument and slightly more like a person. "Nice room," he said. "I've always thought so," she said. "Sit down. Coffee." They worked for 3 hours, which was not what she had anticipated. She had expected it to be fractious, the territorial instincts of 2 families who had been pointedly prospering across a bay from each other for generations, creating friction at every professional junction. Instead it was, she had to admit, rather efficient. He had read everything. He had done the same arithmetic she had, and arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusions. He pushed back on her estimates in 2 places, and he was right both times, which she acknowledged with as much good grace as she could manage, which was actually quite a lot, because she had been expecting to be annoyed and was instead finding it unexpectedly interesting to talk to someone who matched her line by line. By the time they'd worked out a rough division of roles and established the basic framework of a joint partnership structure, it was early afternoon and the coffee was finished and the fire had burned down to coals. Ellison sat back in the armchair and looked at the document on the table and thought that this was either going to work very well or be a complete disaster, and she had genuinely no idea which. "There's one more thing," Caleb said. He was looking at the bay through the window, his profile to her, and the winter light caught the line of his jaw, and she found herself doing the thing she'd been carefully not doing since Wednesday evening, which was looking at him with more attention than was strictly necessary. "My brother," he said. "Alistair is already here." He and I have different views about the direction of the family business. I wanted you to know because it may create some noise in the background. It won't affect our partnership, he added, turning back to her, his gaze direct and clear. That's between you and me. She studied him for a moment. You say that with a lot of certainty for a man who's just told me his brother has different views. I'm certain about my own decisions, he said simply, and she found that she believed him, which was interesting because she generally required significantly more evidence before believing anyone about anything. The storm came on a Friday. It arrived the way November storms arrive on the Scottish coast, not dramatically all at once, but in stages, the sky darkening through the afternoon from gray to the particular shade of charcoal that local people recognized as a warning. They had been out at the boundary marker, walking the actual shoreline they'd been discussing in all their documents, because she'd mentioned she wanted to see it with her own eyes, and he'd said he'd had the same thought and suggested they go together. The weather forecast had been cautiously optimistic about the morning. The morning had delivered on its promise. The afternoon had revised its position without informing anyone. The old watchtower sat exactly on the boundary between their family's land, a remnant of something earlier than the castle or the hotel, its original purpose unclear, but its stone walls still solid. It had a door that locked from the inside and a fireplace that worked, which they discovered after some scrambling in the dark among old camping equipment and a box of emergency supplies that dated to roughly 1994. The mobile signal was gone by the time they realized it wasn't coming back. The road along the base of the headland was flooding. Caleb looked at it and said, "We're not getting a car through that tonight." Not dramatic about it, simply accurate. So there they were. The fire was small but real, throwing orange light against the curved stone walls. Caleb had found a camping lantern in the box of supplies, and it gave everything a warm amber quality that was either atmospheric or simply practical, depending on how you chose to think about it. Ellison chose to think about it practically. She was sitting on the better of the two sleeping bags they'd found rolled up in the corner, her back against the wall, and Caleb was across from her with his long legs extended toward the fire, and between them was the reality of the situation, which was that they were stuck here together until morning. "So," she said. "So," he agreed. "We could talk about the East parcel documentation." "We could," he said. "Do you want to?" She looked at the fire. "Not especially." "Then don't," he said, and there was something in the simplicity of it that made her feel, unexpectedly, like she could put something down that she'd been carrying. Not the documents, not the business, the performing, the careful calibration of what she showed and what she didn't, which had been such a constant activity for so long that she'd largely stopped noticing she was doing it. "How long have you been running everything yourself?" she said. "The castle, the business." He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "About 5 years. My father's heart was already struggling. I was coming up to do more and more, and then eventually I was doing everything and my father was ceremonially attending events." He paused. "Your father the same?" "Similar," she said. "Except I was in Edinburgh doing it from a distance, which is its own particular pleasure." She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them. The fire was warming the air, but the stone held cold. "He won't tell me how bad it is." "They don't," Caleb said. "Mine didn't either. Right until he couldn't anymore." She looked at him. In the firelight his face was different, the usual composed, guarded quality softened into something more available. He was looking at the flames, and there was a tiredness there that she recognized because she saw it in the mirror most mornings, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been the responsible one for long enough that it's stopped being a role and becomes simply their shape. "Your mother," she said carefully. "I'm sorry. I know it's been years, but I don't think I ever said it." "You didn't need to," he said. "We were strangers." He was quiet for a moment. "She died when I was 26, after a long illness. She had a strong will and a very bad heart, and she spent the last 2 years fighting both of those facts at once. The stress of it aged her faster than the illness did, I think." His voice was steady, the steadiness of someone who has made peace with a grief, not of someone who has escaped it. "She loved the coast. She'd grown up looking at your hotel from our side of the bay." Ellison thought about her mother, who had died differently and earlier, when Ellison was 19, and whose rose bushes were currently attempting to eat the east wing, and who had also loved the coast with the particular possessiveness of people who considered a specific stretch of landscape to be theirs by right of devotion. My mother planted roses along the garden wall, she said. Every year, they get more ambitious. I've seen them, he said. In the summer. From the water. You sail? I try to. I'm not especially good at it. Something shifted in his face, something almost self-deprecating, which she hadn't seen before. I'm better at the planning stages than the execution. That seems useful in a business context. It's less useful on a boat in a Force 4. She laughed, and it came out real, not managed, and he looked at her when it happened with an expression that was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from him. Not surprise exactly. Something more careful than surprise. Something that noticed. The fire burned lower and the night settled in, and they kept talking, which was the surprising part. Not about business. About the coast. About growing up on it. About the specific peculiarity of inheriting something enormous and old and beautiful and slightly broken. About Edinburgh. About his time in London before he returned to take on the castle. 3 years of finance, and a particular kind of efficient loneliness that he described very precisely, and that she recognized in her own chest when he named it. At some point she had moved, without entirely registering the decision, to the same side of the fire. They were both sitting against the wall now, with the better sleeping bag across both their laps, because the stone floor was cold and warmth was a practical matter, and there was nothing else to read into it. Except that she was very aware of the 6 inches of space between her shoulder and his, and she thought he was too. Ellison, he said. He said her name the way someone picks up something they've been handling carefully, with attention. It was the first time he'd used it. She said, which was not a word but was something. This is complicated, he said. Everything's complicated, she said. That's not a reason. He turned his head and looked at her, and the fire was almost nothing now, mostly coals, and in the amber dark his face was very close. A reason for what? He said, and his voice was quieter than it had been all evening. I have no idea, she said honestly. And then he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not a testing, uncertain, this might be a mistake kind of kiss. It was the kind of kiss that comes from something that has been accumulating pressure for long enough that when it finally breaks it does so completely. And she kissed him back with the same comprehensiveness, her hand going to the front of his sweater, her whole body leaning into the warmth of him. And everything she'd been managing and maintaining and carefully presenting to the world tilted sideways, and nothing fell, and it was terrifying and exactly right. When they pulled apart, the fire was coals and the lantern was still burning, and outside the storm was still going, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And then she said, "This is complicated," which was not original, but was accurate. "Yes," he said. His hand was still in her hair. His eyes were the color of the sea at night. "The families," she said. "The history. The partnership agreement." "Yes," he said again. "We can't tell anyone," she said. "Not yet. Not until the project is further along and we can show them it's working, show them it isn't only about this." "It isn't only about this," he said carefully. "No," she agreed. "Not only." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was warm and solid and real. Outside, the storm made its various arguments against the tower, and the tower, as it had been doing for 6 centuries, ignored them. She thought, "I don't know what this is yet. I thought I knew what most things were. I am comfortable with not knowing this." That was new. That was interesting. The weeks that followed existed in 2 registers simultaneously, which was not a comfortable way to live, but was not unmanageable. In the first register, everything was professional and correct. She and Caleb met 3 times a week in the hotel library to work on the project. They were efficient, focused, good at this. Their solicitors spoke to each other. The grant application was strong. In the second register, there were evenings. Mostly at the tower, where they'd left the sleeping bags after the storm and had since added a better lantern and a good bottle of whiskey and 2 camp chairs, which Caleb had brought on a Tuesday, without saying anything about it, simply appeared with them. And she had felt something warm and foolish move through her at the sight of those chairs because it was such a specific and practical kind of hopefulness, the kind that makes provision without announcement. There were walks along the beach at low tide when the village was quiet. There were moments in the library between sections of documents when the professionalism thinned for a few minutes before they both, with a kind of shared, wordless coordination, returned to what they were supposed to be doing. She learned things. He drank his coffee black and strong. He had read most of the books in her library and had opinions about a surprising number of them. He could not cook anything except scrambled eggs, and one specific soup his mother had made, which he reproduced from memory without a recipe. He was, beneath the careful professional surface, genuinely funny in a dry, understated way that rewarded attention. He learned, in turn, that she was most honest after 11 o'clock at night, that she had a laugh she almost never used, a real one, different from the social one, that when it came out it surprised her too, that she was fierce about her father in a way that went past obligation into something that was also partly guilt, for the years in Edinburgh, for the distance. And she found, in those weeks, that something she had not expected was happening. Something better than desire and more frightening. She was happy. Specifically, precisely, foolishly happy. In the way of someone who has been managing so many things for so long and has unexpectedly found one thing they are not managing, one thing that is simply happening to them, and it is good. She should have known. That happiness arrived with its own gravity. That what you loved became the thing that could be used against you. Alistair Mackenzie had arrived in Dunmore on a black Wednesday in a car too wide for the village high street, which he'd parked on the double yellow lines with the confidence of someone who had decided to stop finding rules relevant. Caleb had mentioned this with a flatness that she was learning to decode as suppressed feeling. She had seen Alistair once, at a distance, crossing the castle car park with the purposeful stride of someone who found their current location an insult. He was older than Caleb, taller by an inch, with the kind of aggressive handsomeness that photographs well and weathers badly. She had thought, watching him from across the bay, there is a man who has mistaken being feared for being respected. Caleb said his brother had opinions about the castle's direction. He thought the heritage angle was sentimentality and the boutique market was too slow and the real opportunity was large-scale development, corporate conference packages, a complete repositioning. Caleb said his brother was wrong and said it with the calm certainty of someone who has had this argument many times and stopped finding it interesting. What Caleb didn't tell her, and what she wouldn't learn until much later, was that Alistair had noticed the change in him, had been watching, with the particular attention of someone who treats other people's vulnerabilities as information, the small shifts in his younger brother's behavior. The better mood. The 2 nights a week when he wasn't reachable by the family's efficient systems of communication and expectation. She was deep in a week of demanding paperwork when Morag called. Morag was one of her oldest friends and not prone to dramatic phrasing, and she said, "Ellison, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it any other way." Alistair had been at the village hall committee meeting that afternoon, ostensibly representing the castle while Caleb was in Glasgow. And Alistair had been charming and engaged and had, at some point, dropped into conversation, as if incidentally, the information that the Mackenzie and Campbell partnership was performing well and that it was nice to see the families getting along so well, especially Caleb and Robert Campbell's daughter. He had smiled, Morag said, when he said it, the way people smile when they're saying something that looks friendly and is not. Ellison sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and thought about the specific mathematics of what had just happened. Not the exposure itself. That was coming regardless. They'd known that. It was the calculation behind it. Because Alistair hadn't gone to the families. He hadn't made an announcement. He'd gone to a committee meeting and let it drop, casually, in a room full of people who would carry it. He was distributing the information like seeds, letting the community do the work for him. And he'd timed it for when Caleb was out of town. She called Caleb. He was back from Glasgow that evening. They met at the tower, and she told him what Morag had said, and she watched his face do something careful and contained. "He's been watching," Caleb said. "I should have expected it." "How much trouble is this?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "It doesn't change anything between us. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I'm asking about the rest of it. The project. The families." She paused. "My father." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "My brother thinks I'm losing my objectivity. He wants to acquire your property, not collaborate with it." He said it directly, no softening. "And are you," she said, "losing your objectivity?" He looked at her. Something moved in his face, quite unguarded. And for a moment he was completely present, no management of anything, just looking at her with a feeling that was enormous and straightforward. "About the business, no? About other things?" He paused. "I think probably yes." She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his and left it there. "We go forward as we were," she said. "We finish the project. We tell our families properly, on our terms, when we're ready. My brother, Caleb said quietly, is going to try harder. Then we'll deal with it, she said. She said it with the confidence of someone who doesn't know yet what harder looks like. She learned what harder looked like 6 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, in the way these things usually arrive, without warning, from a direction you weren't watching. She was in the kitchen when she heard her father on the phone. She wasn't listening. She was making tea and half-reading an email until she heard her father's voice change register. Go quieter. Go careful. In the way that a voice goes careful when it's receiving information that requires immediate processing. She stood very still with the kettle in her hand. She heard him say yes, and then, I see. And then a long silence. And then, I'll speak to my daughter. When he came into the kitchen, he looked old in a way that had nothing to do with his illness. He sat down at the pine table and folded his hands on it and looked at them, and she put the kettle down and sat across from him and waited, because the feeling at the base of her sternum was cold now and very precise. Someone, he said, has sent a document to Caleb Mackenzie. A document from 1997, about the insurance claim after the old Mackenzie warehouse fire. He looked up at her, and his eyes were full of something that she would have called shame if she'd known what to do with it. Allison, I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. What he told her took perhaps 20 minutes, though it felt longer and also shorter simultaneously. The warehouse fire had been an accident, genuinely. But the insurance claim after, the assessment of the losses, the documentation that determined the payout, that had not been honest. Her father had altered figures. Not dramatically, but enough. He had been young and frightened, and the hotel was in trouble, and he had seen an opportunity, and he had taken it. The consequence he had not fully understood until much later, was that the altered documentation had been drawn into the legal proceedings against the Mackenzie family's warehouse operations, and Ellen Mackenzie, Caleb's mother, had been pulled into those proceedings, and the 18 months of legal pressure had been part of what had broken her health. Allison sat with all of this settling into her like cold water rising. You're telling me now, she said. Yes, he said. You didn't tell me when I started working with the Mackenzies, she said. When I started, she stopped. I know, he said. And then, quietly, I'm sorry, Allison. I have been sorry for 20 years. I have not known how to be brave enough to say it. She left the kitchen and went to the library and sat in the dark for a long time without turning any lights on. She tried calling Caleb. No answer. She tried again. No answer. She sent a message. I know about the document. I need to talk to you. Please. No response. He came to the hotel the next morning. She knew it was him from the sound of the gate, or perhaps from some other mechanism she didn't have a name for yet, some new attunement to the specific quality of his presence. She went to the front door and opened it before he knocked. He looked terrible, not disheveled, not undone, nothing external. But his face had done something overnight that changed its whole quality, like a landscape after the temperature has dropped and everything has frozen in place. Whatever softness had accumulated over the past weeks was gone. His eyes were the color of November water. He had the document in his hand. When did you know? He said. Last night, she said. My father told me last night. Caleb, when did you know? He said again. And there was something in the repetition that was very quiet and very terrible. I told you. Last night. I didn't know before that. I had no idea. The timing is interesting, he said. His voice was controlled in the way that something under enormous pressure is controlled, by not moving at all. You initiate a partnership. You begin a personal relationship with me. And all this time your family holds documents showing your father's direct responsibility for the case that destroyed my mother's health. I didn't know, she said. Caleb, please. My mother spent 14 months being deposed and financially pressured for something that should have been settled, he said. She had a heart condition we didn't know was serious yet. The stress made it serious. The stress is what started everything that followed. He looked at her, and the flatness in his expression was worse than anger would have been. And your father knew. All of this time. My father's actions are not mine, she said, and heard her voice crack slightly, not with tears, with urgency. I am not my father. I did not know. I would never have. If I had known, I would have told you immediately, would you? He said. Only 2 words. But the worst thing he'd said, because it contained the possibility that he wasn't sure, that he was applying his brother's logic to her, laying her actions over the template Alistair had provided, and finding a shape that fit. "Yes," she said. "Caleb." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. The sea was behind him through the open door, the morning light on the water cold and bright, and she stood in the doorway of the house her great-grandfather had built and looked at the man she was in love with, which was a thing she hadn't said to anyone and had barely said to herself. And she could feel the decision happening behind his eyes, and she could not make it go the way it needed to go. She couldn't reach it. "I need some time," he said finally. "Of course," she said, because what else was there? He left. She stood in the doorway for a while after he was gone, looking at the bay, and then she went inside and was very busy for the rest of the day doing things that didn't require her to feel anything. What followed was the kind of period that people who've been through it describe with careful brevity. She continued to manage the project, because the project continued regardless, and there were contractors and grant administrators who required answers, and she gave them. She continued to manage the hotel. She continued to manage her father, who was quieter now and looked at her with such specific guilt that she had to sometimes leave the room. Through his solicitor, Caleb sent a letter indicating he was withdrawing from active participation and transferring his responsibilities to a project manager, while maintaining the legal partnership agreement, which he was not dissolving. She read the letter twice and thought, he hasn't ended it. He stepped back from it. There was a difference. She decided to treat the difference as significant rather than as lawyerly self-protection. She decided this on purpose, because the alternative was considerably darker. Alistair moved fast. Her bank manager called to discuss the review of the hotel's operating credit line, which had been acquired by a financial holding company she'd never heard of. Her solicitor called about the hotel's property lease on the South Car Park, which had been assigned to a company called Dunmore Coastal Holdings Limited. A 30-second search informed her that this company had been registered 11 days ago. Its director was listed as A.J. Mackenzie. She put down the phone and looked at the ceiling for a moment and thought, there it is. And then one afternoon Alistair came to see her himself, arriving without calling, which she thought was intentional. She came down the main stairs in her work clothes and found him standing in the center of the lobby, assessing the room with the calculation of someone pricing it per square meter. His suit was extraordinary. His smile, when he deployed it, was the kind that had been very effective for a long time and knew it. "Miss Campbell," he said, "I thought it might be useful for us to talk, now that the situation between our families has become somewhat clarified." "Clarified," she said. She did not invite him to sit down. "The documents your father falsified," Alistair said. "You understand the exposure there. Civil liability, potentially. Criminal proceedings at worst. And the current financial position of the hotel isn't, I'd imagine, robust enough to sustain a prolonged legal challenge." "Is that a threat?" she said pleasantly. "It's a situation assessment," he said. "I'm a business person. What I am interested in is a sensible resolution. The hotel, the land, the south parcel. Clean sale, fair valuation. You're free to go back to Edinburgh with money in your pocket and no legal cloud over you." He smiled. "And you don't have to continue watching my brother make a fool of himself on your behalf." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll think about it," she said. His expression showed, just briefly, the surprise of someone who expected a different response. "The offer has a timeline." "I'm sure it does," she said. "My receptionist will show you out." After he left, she went back upstairs and sat on the floor of the East Wing and looked at the ceiling and thought about her options with the concentrated clarity that arrives when things are bad enough that your mind stops trying to protect you and simply presents the situation as it is. Her father was in hospital that week, a planned admission for a procedure that was hopefully going to improve his cardiac function. She visited every day. Each visit she thought, "I am not selling this hotel." And each visit she also thought, "I need to solve this before it becomes something he needs to carry." On the third day she arrived at the hospital and found Caleb there. He was in the corridor outside her father's room, slightly damp from the rain, holding a folder of documents and looking, when he saw her, like someone who had rehearsed a version of this moment that didn't involve her being precisely here. "I came for the papers," he said. "The Coastal Survey originals. I need them for the planning authority." "I know where they are," she said. "I can get them." "I didn't know you'd be here," he said. "He's my father," she said. "I'm here every day." They stood in the hospital corridor, and the fluorescent light was unkind, and the situation was not comfortable, and she thought, I have about 30 seconds before one of us makes an excuse and leaves, and I am not going to let that happen. Your brother came to see me, she said. He's buying up the hotel's debt. He wants me to sell. Caleb's face changed. Something moved through it, fast and not comfortable. What did you say? I told him I'd think about it, she said. I'm not going to. But I need you to understand what's happening. I know what's happening, Caleb said, and the flatness she'd heard in his voice weeks ago was gone, replaced by something harder to name. I've been looking at Alistair's acquisitions. He went through our family files. He found the insurance documents in our own archive and prepared them for distribution after he decided I was becoming a liability. He stopped. Started again. There are dates in the file. Alistair presented them to me with a different sequence. He made it look as though the document was prepared strategically, that you knew everything and were using the relationship to protect your father. He looked at her directly for the first time in weeks. You'd have had to be watching for an opportunity and ready to deploy information at a precise moment. Your father did something wrong, but Alistair manufactured everything else. She breathed carefully. When did you work this out? Piece by piece, he said, starting about 2 weeks after I walked away. From you. He looked as though the next words cost something. I walked away because I was in pain, and because my brother handed me something that fit the pain I was already carrying. And I should have asked you more questions before I chose to believe him. The corridor was quiet. A nurse went past. The fluorescent light hummed its indifferent note. Your mother, she said finally. My father's actions were real. Whatever Alistair manipulated, what my father did was real. Yes, he said, and your father will answer for that. But that's not you. No, she said. It's not. Ellison, you have to get your brother away from my hotel, she said, not because she didn't want to hear the rest, but because the hotel was immediate and real, and she had learned, in the weeks of managing everything alone, to deal with the real and immediate first. He's meeting with me next week to finalize a purchase offer. I'm going to need that meeting to go differently. Caleb was already reaching for his phone. He's not going to finalize anything, he said, with the quiet, complete certainty of someone who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. Give me 48 hours. And then, he said, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I would like you to answer them. She looked at him for a long moment in the fluorescent light. Go fix it, she said. Then we'll talk. What Caleb did in those 48 hours, she learned in pieces. The first arrived via her solicitor. The holding company that had acquired the hotel's credit line had been declared invalid pending review. The second was Morag texting. Something happening at the castle. Alistair's car is leaving. Is this yours? The third was a formal notice that the South Car Park lease challenge was being withdrawn. And then Caleb called. He sounded like himself. The version of himself she'd come to know over months of evenings in the tower, not the public version. The acquisition of your credit line was done using misrepresented internal McKinsey assets, he said, which gives me grounds for immediate action as primary director. Alistair's legal counsel has advised him he has 4 days before the irregularities trigger a regulatory review. He's decided to return to New York. Just like that. He's a businessman, Caleb said. He calculates losses. This one was clear. There was a pause. My father knows everything. He and Alistair had a conversation I was not present for, whose conclusion was that Alistair is stepping back from all family business interests in Scotland. He paused again. Can I come to see you? Come now, she said. I'll make coffee. He came. It was raining, which seemed appropriate. He came in through the front door and stood in the lobby and looked at her, and she looked at him, and both of them were people who had been through something that had required a great deal of them, and it showed, not dramatically but in the face, in the careful quality of how a person stands. I hurt you, he said. I know that. I chose to believe something that I should have examined, because examining it would have required me to be less angry, and the anger was easier to live in than the alternative. The alternative being what? She said. Grief, he said simply. My mother. Your father's involvement, whatever the shape of it. If I was angry at you, I didn't have to feel the rest of it. She thought about this. About the way pain looks for a container and takes the first one that fits. I know something about that, she said. I know you do, he said. I was watching you do it for months, and he stopped. I should have been braver. You're being brave now, she said. Too late, he said. Or possibly exactly late enough. I genuinely don't know which. He looked at her with everything showing, everything he usually kept in order presented in disarray, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever seen anyone do. I'm not here to ask you to go back to where we were. I know it's not that simple. I came to say that I am sorry, that I was wrong in the specific way that people are wrong when they choose what's comfortable over what's true, and to ask whether there is any version of this that still exists, that we can build from. She was quiet for a moment. You hurt me, she said. I want to be clear about that. Not the accusation. The choosing not to believe me. That was the part that mattered. I know, he said. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, she said. It's not fine. It happened, and it was real, and it's going to take some time to recalibrate. Yes, he said. I understand. But, she said, and watched the careful, patient quality of how he waited, not with expectation but with attention, and thought. This is the part of him I trust. This. I think there's something worth recalibrating for. He breathed out, very quietly. I have thought so for 6 weeks, he said. Then we take it slowly, she said. And honestly. And we don't hide any of it. No more hiding anything, he agreed. She looked at him standing in the lobby of her family's hotel, the rain running down the windows behind him, and thought about all the things that would still need to be dealt with. Her father's health, the project, the history, the slow legal proceedings that would follow. It was a great deal. It was not simple. Coffee, she said. Then we make a list. His mouth moved in the almost amusement she'd first noticed at the village hall dinner and had come to recognize as, in its way, warmth. A list, he said. I work from lists, she said. Come on. The months that followed were less a story and more a process, which was probably how real things went. The coastal restoration project moved through its phases: ground surveys, heritage assessments, planning hearings, contractor procurement. She and Caleb ran it together, properly this time, openly. When they disagreed, which they did with some regularity, it was the productive kind, the kind that moved things. Their solicitors stopped sounding like opposing parties and began to sound like people working on the same thing. Her father came home from hospital improved. He carried his guilt differently now, more visibly, less alone. He and Caleb had a meeting that Ellison was not present for, by choice, because some things need to happen between the people who are actually involved, and her presence would have changed what could be said. Caleb told her afterward only that it had been a hard conversation and necessary, and that it was done. She accepted this. She and Caleb told their families on a Sunday in February, in the library, over lunch, with both fathers present. She had been more nervous than she expected. Caleb had been calm in the way he was calm when he was paying close attention to everything, and she had noticed his hand find hers under the table and stay there. Robert Campbell had looked at Caleb for a long moment, and then said, quietly, that he was glad. Alistair Mackenzie Sr., who was a large, quiet man whose younger son had clearly inherited his capacity for stillness, and whose older son had clearly found something different to inherit, said it was about time someone had the sense to end this particular piece of nonsense, which had gone on long enough. The shoreline opened in late spring, on a day the coast offered up like a gift, clear and bright, with a wind that was just enough to make flags move without doing any damage. There was a small ceremony because the grant required it, and speeches that ran slightly long because there were always speeches that ran slightly long, and there were journalists and a representative from the Heritage Fund in Morag, who was officially there as a villager and unofficially there because Ellison had texted her at 6 that morning saying please come. The shoreline itself was better than the plans, which was not always the case. The stonework had been done properly, with care for the original material, and the path followed the natural curve of the coast, so that when you walked it you moved with the landscape rather than across it. The viewing point at the far end, where the two headlands were closest, and you could see both the hotel and the castle in the same glance, had a bench made from reclaimed oak, and on the bench was a small plaque that said, simply, Dunmore Shore, restored 2026, Campbell Mackenzie. She stood at the viewing point after the ceremony, when most people had started moving toward the refreshments, and looked at the plaque. Campbell Mackenzie. Two names that had spent a century in opposition, occupying the same sentence now as though it were the most natural arrangement in the world. Perhaps it had always been the most natural arrangement, and the opposition had been the effort, the sustained, exhausting, generational effort of maintaining a separation that the geography and the history and the people themselves were always going to argue against. Caleb came to stand beside her. He had been in conversation with the Heritage Fund representative, doing the professional thing with the practiced ease she'd spent months watching and which no longer made her feel challenged, but simply comfortable, simply like watching someone she knew be good at something. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. I think that went adequately. Adequately, she said. We spent 14 months on this. The speeches could have been shorter, he said. Your speech was 8 minutes. The Heritage Fund representatives was 22. It averaged out. She looked at the plaque again. Campbell Mackenzie, she said. In that order because it's alphabetical. Obviously, he said. Your brother's going to hate it from New York. My brother, Caleb said, with equanimity, can hate it from New York. He called last week. He's working at a fund in Connecticut. He sounded, I thought, slightly less like himself. Is that good? I think it might be a start of something, he said. I don't want to be angry at him forever. It's expensive. She thought about that. About the expense of anger. About her father, who had carried his guilt like a stone for 20 years because he hadn't known how to put it down. About the thing that happens when you finally stop maintaining a position you've held for so long you've forgotten it was a choice. No, she said. It is. He turned and looked at her, and the light was on the water behind him, and the day was the gift it had offered, and she thought, as she had been thinking with increasing frequency and decreasing surprise, I love this person. It is a very specific love, for a very specific, particular, occasionally maddening, profoundly decent person, and I have no intention of putting it down. Ellison, he said. What, she said. Nothing, he said. Just checking. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her, and they stood there on the reconstructed shore, on the land that had been in dispute and was no longer, in the light of a spring afternoon that was being generous. And behind them the hotel and the castle faced each other across the bay, as they had for centuries, but differently now, like two sides of the same thing, which was perhaps what they had always been. The gulls were doing their complicated business above the water. The wind moved off the sea with the specific smell of salt and distance. The shore held them, stone and path and new wood and the enduring, patient geography of the coast that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after, remembering nothing and minding nothing and simply going on. She went on. They went on. Together, which was the point.